All right. Now we're going to go into the Enlightenment, the other major philosophical, theoretical, and also political development of the 1700s. So much of the last couple of lectures going up to the first test are more about ideas than anything else. Powerful ideas that change the way people think and act in society in a lot of ways. So last time we talked about the awakening and how that gave people a lot of choice in what to pursue. The Enlightenment starts taking that a step further, and a big step further. The Enlightenment, though, is almost the polar opposite in religious views as the Awakening. The Awakening wants emotional connections, emotional outbursts, and mass conversion. The Enlightenment wants almost the exact opposite. They want to take emotion out of analysis. And they want to create what they think of as objective thought and scientific reasoning. And they think that that will allow humans to develop much better progress and really free people from a lot of the major social problems that societies have built up over thousands of years. The Enlightenment is also heavily connected to another philosophical type movement in the 1600s in Western Europe in particular, called the Scientific Revolution, the European Scientific Revolution. This is where the Europeans start catching up to some of the other worldwide civilizations, like the Ottoman Empire, Islamic civilization, Chinese civilization. They start catching up technologically. Because in the 1600s is the point in European history where Europeans start trying to move away from using religious ideas as the definition for why things happen. And they start seeking other definitions, other theories, for things that they didn't understand, like why do hurricanes happen? What is gravity? And people had known for a long time that you pick something up, and if you drop it or throw it, it tends to fall. And they couldn't explain it. And a lot of the religious leaders say it's because God wants it to fall. God's using His power to bring things down to what they believe was the center of the universe, Earth. Because everything is attracted down, right, into the ground. The scientific revolution gets kick-started in Europe, for the most part in the 1600s, and a guy named Isaac Newton defined gravity in a mathematical book called the Principia. It's a Latin term, the principles. The Enlightenment takes a lot of those ideas about using mathematics to justify how things are happening, and they try to take it a step further from what we today recognize as the hard sciences: gravity, astronomy, physics, geology. And they start to apply it more to human societies: politics, economics, morality, ideas about equality, egalitarian philosophy. So we're going to get into that today. And again, the Enlightenment gets its beginning from the results of the 1600s in Western Europe, particularly the Scientific Revolution. The Enlightenment takes a lot of definitions of what scientists, or early kind of European scientists, would call the natural laws. The natural law of gravity is that things are attracted to the center of the Earth. And the Enlightenment, though, makes a break with the Scientific Revolution. The scientists want to study chemistry, human anatomy, geology, all these what we would today call the hard sciences. And they start applying this to social research. Because they believe that these natural laws that create hurricanes or create gravity or really make things happen in the physical world, if you study those laws enough, you can understand how gravity operates, or why the tides move in certain ways. All you have to do is study it enough, build up a database, and then you can understand it mathematically. And the Enlightenment in the late 1600s and early 1700s starts taking those ideas and starting to apply them to human society. If you can understand the natural laws that drive human events and human interactions, then you can understand how to build better political systems or better economic systems, or systems for better social equality. So they're literally trying to take mathematics out of its kind of natural areas and apply it to human society. And they worship this idea of reason. When you think of reason, think of it in their terms as critical thought, objective thought, rational thought. That's what they use the word reason to mean. That is what reason is to them. And in the Enlightenment, the philosophers and the people who follow the Enlightenment are its biggest supporters, create reason almost as a religion in itself. They worship it. They pursue it. So reason becomes a kind of open road for the Enlightenment. So they want to use rational thought as the system of pursuing enlightenment, of pursuing how do you build better systems for better human freedom and happiness and whatnot. But reason is also the goal. Reason is the place you want to go to. So you want to use rational thought to build up more and more rational thought. And their idea is that in the future, human society can become perfected. If people just become more objective, they're not so much attached to their emotional ideas. If they can use their critical thinking skills, we can do great things in society. Does that make sense? So reason is special to the Enlightenment and to their major philosophers and their followers, because it's the method of achieving enlightenment, and it's also the end goal of enlightenment. So this is the kind of formula that they're operating with, this kind of flow chart. The scientific method that emerged in the European scene in the 1600s, the scientific method of collecting data by doing research, posing a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis according to experimentation, collecting more data, and then trying to understand if your hypothesis was correct or not. If it is, you try to go further. If it's not, you readjust the hypothesis to, meet what the data is telling you. The basic scientific method that we all should have learned about many years ago. When we're in grade school, basically. That's the system of critical thought. And the Enlightenment, the Europeans, a lot of them in the 1700s, those who follow this Enlightenment movement say that the more you pursue the scientific method, the more you understand about how the world functions, and the more you understand about how human societies function. So you can come to better and better definitions of what's going on. And if you understand what's going on in a clearer sense, then you can adjust things in more rational ways. So you can fix problems. You can build better buildings that can resist hurricanes or something like that. If you understand how the hurricanes operate or how earthquakes operate, you can build better buildings, and therefore if an earthquake hits, less people get killed. But also politically. If you understand why people make governments and what governments are supposed to do, then you can, say, cut out the fat and the corruption and all that kind of stuff out of government. And you can make a better government that serves its people, rather than just serving the powerful interests who tend to rule governments, especially back then with monarchies and dictatorships and whatnot. So they believe that if you pursue critical thought and you build up education systems for the masses, remember, in the 1600s, most Europeans don't know how to read. If you build up schools and you let younger people go to school rather than having to work all the time, then they can learn to read and they can access the new ideas that are coming out. And they can become experts, and they can contribute to the kind of wave of human knowledge that starts to emerge. And if you can educate the masses to the point where they can all think rationally, they can all run experiments, and you can get great ideas from a whole lot of people who never would have had that opportunity before. So if all society is enlightened, then they literally believe they would create the perfect world, the perfect human society. And education had a big part in that. Because you can't just educate the rich elite people, because they may try to control things still. So if you educate everybody, this is where the calls for public education start in Europe. And they say that that's a fundamental thing that government is supposed to do. Any government that doesn't educate its children, its population, is not a very good government by the end of the Enlightenment. And that demand goes forth. So they see education as the way of achieving progress. And if you can continue making progress, eventually you're going to get better and better and better. And they believe that they could perfect the human condition. So the Enlightenment is overwhelmingly optimistic. They can overcome all the greed and all the corruption and all the problems and all the violence and all the bad distribution of resources and all the poverty. They believe all you have to do is continue more scientific research and build better systems. And you can alleviate huge amounts of human pain in the world. And they literally believed that they were going to solve the world's problems. So, questions about this at all so far? No. Okay. And, they pushed for it. This is a graph of literacy rates, a little bit of a skewed graph, because on the left side you have just general numbers of people who know how to read. On the right side you have these percentages, and you can see it's not a very good chart because 1% is like a quarter of the graph, then it shoots up to 10% very quickly, and that 10% goes to 100%. So the graph is a little skewed. But from the statistics we know of, European society was about 1% educated from, say, about the year 200 BCE, 200 years BC in a lot of textbooks, and it stayed around 1% until the 1200s, and maybe got up to about 2 or 5% until about the 1600s. You get up to 10%, and look at where the big jump hits. From about 10% to somewhere around 85, 90%. It happens in the 17 and 1800s. Because they pushed it. And they started to take a view that a government that doesn't do this is a government that should not exist. Something has to change. And this is where the big push hits. To the point where today, even though most Americans read at somewhere around a 4th grade level, they at least know how to read a TV guide or something like that. Whereas back then, before the 1500s, most people wouldn't be able to read and write their own name. And that's a very real thing. So they very much believed in literacy as the foundation of education, and then once you can read, you can access ideas and be taught, and sometimes even do your own research and learn for yourself. Okay, Europe becomes known. There's a popular term that moves around Europe called the Republic of Letters, which shows us how obsessed they were with learning to read and write. This became a popular thing to do. This is something that rich people could do. Therefore, a lot of people who wanted to be rich start emulating the rich, and they start learning to read and write themselves. And you get the printing of more books. Books become cheaper to buy. Paper becomes cheaper to buy. And it becomes a cool thing to write letters, to hear from your distant relatives. And this is where you first start getting the large national post office types of systems, mail delivery. Because it was cool and fun to write letters and read about different things from different parts of the world. And Europeans become obsessed with this. So this movement toward literacy generally becomes known in Europe as the so-called Republic of Letters, and it's a republic without nationality. This is not something that just the British people do because they're British. This is something that the Europeans say all people should do, or at least have the opportunity to do. And there's several different things that push the growth of reading rates. And as once reading rates start to grow, you start getting results that push further reading rates. So this becomes a cyclical increase. Number one, the growth of cheap printing. The Europeans get their first major printing press in the 1450s, and it takes a couple hundred years to get it really, really super efficient. But by the 1700s, the average person could go buy a newspaper. And this is where newspapers start coming into existence in the early 1700s. Because they're cheap enough for someone to go off and buy the daily news events, reports of the news for just a few cents. And that was cheap enough for average workers to be able to do that. Whereas before, learning to read was a rare thing, and therefore books were expensive things that only rich people owned. Growing wealth of writers. Before the Enlightenment in Europe, writers made money by having patrons, which means a rich person gives you a place to live and food to eat so you can write beautiful poems and whatnot that the family would usually own, your employer. But when a lot of people now learn to read and reading becomes a cool thing to do, people start buying books and pamphlets. So a lot of writers don't want to attach themselves to wealthy families who sometimes control what they write. Instead, they will try to publish a short pamphlet. And if you can get millions of people buying your little book for just a few cents, that equals out to a lot of money. Just like today with the power of the internet. Right? This has empowered musicians and small-time filmmakers and writers If you can get your book onto Kindle or something like that, there's 7 billion people out there. If you can just get a small percentage of them to buy your work and pay you 10 cents, 50 cents, something like that, that's a lot of money. And this is where this movement toward writers becoming independent. And of course, when they become independent, they start publishing critiques of the system that exists. And we get a lot of famous writers growing up very fast in the 1700s. It also became a very cool thing to go to public debates, philosophical debates. And the rich people largely, who had big houses where they would have maybe a room this size where they could host a large party, instead of getting drunk and throwing things through windows in the middle of the night, they would invite philosophers and they would have philosophical debates. Or a local writer who just published a book would come and talk about his book, and everyone would drink wine and eat cheese and say, "Oh, that's a really cool thing." And they would debate the thing. So these become known as, the French term is the philosophe. That's their type of word for philosopher. So these philosophe debates became known and very popular, especially in Paris, and these meetings became known as the salons. And this becomes advertised, and because a lot of rich people are having a lot of big parties, a lot of the middle class people start writing books because they want to get into the parties, and on and on it goes. Because oftentimes people like to emulate what the rich do to advertise that I might be rich too. So questions about any of these? No. Okay. Perfect clarity again. All right. Here's a famous painting of one of the more famous houses of these debates, these salons. This is Giopan. But this is a painting that depicts a lot of philosophers at the same place at the same time, people who lived in even different centuries. So this is an idea that this is a place where it had a long tradition of high academic debates. They have a statue, I think it's Newton or Voltaire or someone. But the major figures of the Enlightenment are all portrayed in the same place. So you have Rousseau, Montesquieu, people that we'll talk about in this lecture on the general Enlightenment, and the next one on the political ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. So these are very well-known people that start becoming wealthy and famous throughout Europe for their writings. We'll skip past Spinoza because he does a lot of stuff. His biggest contributions, he was an average worker. He was a glassmaker, a kind of like a blacksmith makes horseshoes. He was a person who made things out of glass. So he had a trade, and in his off time, he read and wrote books himself. And he had a lot of different ideas, and some very recent historians have identified Spinoza as one of the foundational people of the Enlightenment. So there's a kind of renewed interest in Spinoza in these past few years. Spinoza, in general, through a lot of his different writings, put a heavy focus on reason. And he lives in the mid-1600s. So this is before a lot of historians identify the Enlightenment as having even started. And there is no great definition of exactly when the Enlightenment starts and when it ends. It really depends on which historian you talk to, which textbook you're reading. They have vastly different interpretations. So there's no set beginning or end date for the thing. But Spinoza is kind of re-emerging as one of the central, early, hugely important, kind of radical philosophers. And again, he's interesting because he was an average worker. He wasn't one of these giant, educated, elite people who just sat in their house drinking wine all day long. He had a job. Okay, but that's Spinoza very, very, very quickly. One of the big problems of the Enlightenment, though, is as you get more and more philosophers debating things, especially going into, say, the mid-1700s, the debates get confusing because they start using terminology that nobody has really agreed upon. So one of the central things, and usually you'll see this if you ever go to a major debate or a major talk or a major presentation, one of the first things that a lot of these thinkers do is define the major terms that they're going to use. And the Enlightenment hadn't done that yet. So you have a lot of philosophers popping up, writing different stuff and using different words to mean different things. And some people, especially this guy living in Paris, Diderot, decided that that's a major problem. That you have to agree on the definitions of terms first before you can have much of a big, impactful debate. So he starts a movement to write down the definitions of the major philosophical terms and publish a book throughout all of Europe and the whole world, so that philosophers know what terms mean what. So he starts off with the idea of basically creating a dictionary, and it grows from there. He calls this the Encyclopedia, which literally means the book of all knowledge that's been gained in the whole world. It grows from just being a simple definition of a term to being a long of what we think of today as an encyclopedia article that could take up several pages in giving a definition of something, and stating what the major ideas, what the major conflicts within that little term are, what the major debates are, and giving you a suggested reading list. And Diderot wanted it to expand to that level. Diderot did not write the whole thing himself. He served largely as the major editor. And this thing is published in many volumes, alphabetically, over many years, over a couple decades. So he does not write the whole thing himself. Who does he go to write the articles? Any ideas? Who writes encyclopedia articles today? Yeah, the experts in the field. So if you want an article describing biology, you don't go to a mathematician, you go to a biologist, right? So he wrote letters to the major philosophical leaders in all these different emerging fields and asked them to contribute an article that defined the major terms that they're using. So there's a lot of communication. They use the post office system throughout Europe. And that's largely how he does it. He does write many articles himself, but he was largely the editor of the thing and brings together the ideas from literally all over Europe and puts them into this one book. And it's his life's work. He's a philosopher himself. He wrote other books too, but this is his giant lifetime project. And he said clearly in the encyclopedia itself, even on the front page of the very first volume, this is to serve the Enlightenment's goal, that all knowledge is attainable. All you have to do is study something enough and build up enough data and work hard at it, and eventually you will come to know how that thing functions. It's just a matter of time and dedication. Time and energy. That's all it takes. And maybe some money. So he says that literally all of nature's mysteries are knowable if you just go through the scientific method process. And his big quote is that all things must be expanded. So everything must be explained without fear of insulting people's emotional ties to certain ideas. So he says, yes, this is going to upset some religious people. This is going to upset some political leaders. But we cannot care. We don't care, and we should not be allowed to care, because we are pursuing the truth. And we should get to the closest definition of that truth as possible without any kind of public pressure. Okay, so here's, he's living in Paris, so this stuff is written in French and then it's translated later. Right here, Temps Primaire, that means the first edition. And it says the Encyclopedia, the official title is the Encyclopedia, or the Dictionary of Reason, of the Sciences, of the Arts, and of the Works. From the Society of the Men of Letters, which is a general term of academics, people who have degrees or have studied this stuff, or are recognized as experts. And it's published in many volumes, because this is a giant project. And it's published over many years, because sometimes when Diderot publishes something that the government doesn't like, what kind of government does France have at this point? An absolutist monarchy. the king and his advisors sometimes send their army and their police forces into Diderot's studio, into his workshop, and they burn it down with everything inside. So Diderot a few times had to start over again. But he didn't let that stop him. He's a very dedicated person. So it takes about 20 years to get it all out, but he does. And this literally becomes a major focus of his entire life. No, I don't have his death of his date, but it wasn't too long after the last one was published, just a few years. So questions about the Encyclopedia at all? Yeah.
Why did they just kill him instead of burning his stuff?
Well, that raises an interesting question. He's a popular guy. He's well known throughout Europe for doing this. So if the government killed him, or if he dies under mysterious reasons suddenly, what would that convince the people of? He's assassinated. That government is afraid of him, which may encourage people to do something about a government who killed him, right? I mean, that could start riots, that could start revolutionary movements, that could start even bigger problems. So if you want to be one of those people who complain about what government's doing, the best thing to do sometimes is to do it loudly and make sure a lot of people know about your complaint. Because that's almost often is an insurance policy against your being targeted for removal one way or another. And a lot of governments have faced that problem throughout the years. Many, many, many. In the middle of the Enlightenment, in the 1750s, there is a giant debate amongst kind of religious and social conservatives who think that there's a lot of them who think the Enlightenment is a waste of time. Why would you want to study things that seem to have no relation to anything important in human life? There's one very powerful writer named Jonathan Swift in the early 1700s who published several works. Probably his most famous is Gulliver's Travels, if you've ever heard of that. And he gives an attack on the Enlightenment in there, where he says, these scientists are sitting around studying all this useless stuff. Like in the book, the character kind of wanders around and he's watching scientists studying and trying to figure out how much sunlight they can trap inside a pumpkin. And the character in the book says, "Well, that's stupid. That's a waste of time. You're kind of an idiot." But that's an insult against the Enlightenment. And he encounters astronomers who, the guy tries to talk to this astronomer, and the astronomer looks up in the sky and says, "Oh, look at that. And see how that's related to that." And sit there and think to himself, to the point where Gulliver has to eventually walk around with like a big fly swatter. And whenever one of these scientists just kind of wanders off in his own thoughts and just kind of sits there, smack him in the face with the fly swatter to bring him back to the conversation. So Swift and others attacked the Enlightenment as useless, waste of time, and kind of actively ridiculous. So there's a controversy amongst people who don't like the Enlightenment and these philosophers that are pursuing it, saying, well, we have to get to the end point. And that's a very open debate by the mid-1700s. How useful is this stuff? And when this event happens, this earthquake just outside of Lisbon, which is the biggest city in Portugal, when this hits, this gives a lot of ammunition for Enlightenment-type thinkers, especially those that are anti-religious. And there's a lot of them in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is really where you first start seeing the most kind of the emergence of public atheism amongst a lot of philosophers who just completely reject the existence of God. And the debate hits because Lisbon experiences an earthquake on November 1st, 1755. Portugal is an overwhelmingly Catholic country. What is November 1st in Catholicism? Does anybody know? It's All Saints' Day, a major religious kind of holiday. So on that day, a lot of Catholics go to church. And the earthquake hit. And the earthquake wasn't the big problem. The tsunami that hit the city, it's a coastal city, after the earthquake, killed tens of thousands of people, including the people who went to church that day. So the major kind of anti-religion, especially anti-Catholic philosophers, like a guy named Voltaire, starts publishing articles saying, this may be proof that if God exists, He doesn't especially care about that religion. Because if those were God's most dedicated followers in the church when the earthquake and the tsunami hit, why didn't God protect them too? They died also. So the Lisbon earthquake becomes a big kind of argumentative point for a lot of philosophers. Does this happen today? Yes, the exact same thing happened on All Saints' Day in one of the South American countries. I can't remember which one. In about, I think, 2006. Again, flattened a lot of churches and killed a lot of the congregations. And again, the atheists of today rise up and say, what the heck? How do you justify that one? So that's a major point of contention then and today going forward. The Enlightenment is spread to the American colonies. So, we're a U.S. history class. So how do these ideas filter into the British colonies in the mid-1700s? Benjamin Franklin rises as a major proponent of the Enlightenment in a lot of different ways, and probably one of the biggest American scientists in the 1750s. So he first launches into notoriety for conducting experiments with electricity. They didn't understand electricity back then. They didn't understand that lightning is electricity in the sky. And a lot of people were afraid of it. They thought it was God's judgment or something like that. And kings of nations, when lightning would hit, they would hide under their beds. And Franklin came up with the theory that lightning is just an electric discharge in the weather. That's a result of natural phenomena. And to prove it, he experimented with it. And he was one of the first to come up with the idea of positive and negative charge. So when he publishes a lot of his theories and the data that he accumulated to prove it, he becomes famous not just in the colonies, but also in Europe. He becomes known in Europe as the first really worthwhile American. The Europeans very much looked down on the colonies as kind of like a backwater where all the kind of untrustworthy, seedy, kind of debt-ridden, ignorant, dirty people go. The Europeans very much looked down on their colonies. But Franklin is one of these who emerges from within the colonies. He moved there at a very early age. And really brought a lot of Enlightenment philosophy to the colonies and really brought the colonies into the European kind of academic world. So this is before he gets involved in politics on almost any kind of American national level. And you can see he lives a long time. And he was fairly wealthy from about the age of 35 or 40. He had a business that made enough money where he didn't have to work anymore. And that's why he went off and did all these experiments. What he's interested in. He went off and pursued his own entertainment. So he came up also with the philosophy of what we would call the human community today. He lived in Philadelphia and loved it there. He and his wealthy friends in the city come together and create the first public library in the colonies in Philadelphia. The first public volunteer firefighting force. If a fire broke out in some part of the city, they didn't have any kind of paid city employees to put the fire out. So it was up to the property owners. Sometimes that doesn't work very much. So Franklin gathered people together and said, we need a volunteer firefighting force to help us all. Because if the fire starts in one part of the city and it's not put out, it can spread and destroy everything. So it's a good idea to have people ready to fight the fire at a moment's notice. He was also an inventor. Came up with a much more efficient fireplace for houses called the Franklin stove, which meant that you could heat your house with a lot less wood so that poorer people could survive the winter times, which if you've ever been back east to the eastern United States, gets pretty cold. He invented bifocal glasses. He invented lightning rods for houses. Lightning used to hit houses and completely annihilate them and start fires. But Franklin understood how electricity worked. So he said, if you just put this metal piece out on the side of your house and you have a wire that goes down into the ground, the lightning will be attracted to the rod first because it's metal, and you could take that charge and just put it into the ground where it becomes harmless. And he invented these things. He could have made a lot of money off of these inventions because they're popular things. Almost everybody's going to use them. But he didn't. He didn't even file for a patent. He said, these are gifts to humankind. He gives them away for free. He says, I don't want to make any money off this. I have enough money to live comfortably. And I would feel guilty for making people pay for stuff that is going to make their lives better. So this is the anti-Apple lawsuit kind of thing, if you've heard about that over the weekend. He is the anti-monopolist. He doesn't want to control this stuff. He just wants to give it away. It benefits everybody, so how can you morally justify trying to make money off it? And Franklin later goes into politics as the American Revolution gets started in the kind of 1760s. So questions about any of him at all or his importance, at least for the Americas? Nope. Okay.
Did the rivalry between Tesla and Edison happen before or after?
Oh, this is long after. That's 100 years after. That happens in the late 1800s. Yeah. And that's another thing. Tesla is one of these people who wants to kind of give it away. And Edison is a person who wants a battery attached to every single electronic device. And guess what he wanted to do? Sell the batteries. Which means everything that ran with electricity, he wanted to make money off it. And he destroyed Tesla. Publicly and personally. But that's also late 1800s, kind of the second half of U.S. history. There's a lot of images of Franklin as a genius, but also, you notice, helped out by the angels in doing his electricity experiment. So when you see these big paintings, a lot of them are heavily imbued with propaganda in one way or another. So this may be an attempt to get more religious conservatives on the side of the Enlightenment or to support what Franklin is doing. But he literally becomes known as the first really internationally famous American. So when the American Revolution starts to hit, when the colonists start to complain about what the British government is doing, the government in London calls on Franklin and says, come over to London and explain what's going on over there. You're the most rational, objective person we have there, so can you please explain this to us? And then they really grilled him for a couple days and insulted him and insulted the colonists and on down that line, but we'll get there eventually. Okay, now we'll get into some kind of subtopics of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment did a lot of different stuff, and we're going to stick with what we would today call the social sciences. Economics, morality, education, politics, what we would today call political science and history. So I want to talk about what the Enlightenment made contributions to some very specific subjects as we see them today. And you'll see a lot of these thinkers reemerging in different areas of the Enlightenment, very different topics, because they thought about a lot of different things. Much like a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers. Like Plato will write on politics and on elements and hard sciences and all kinds of different stuff. So the European Enlightenment will also do a lot of that. John Locke is one of the major early kind of theoretical founders. Locke wrote on a lot of different things. He wrote on politics, on history, on religion, and one of his major pamphlets was on education. So he is publishing his stuff. He's already an older guy by the 1690s. He had been kind of repressed by his government from publishing. So when he gets the opportunity to do it in the 1690s, he just throws it all out there all at once. So his books tend to come out real rapidly in the 1690s. But Locke had a lot of specific ideas about education, and probably his biggest argument is that his quote is that education is really teaching people to be masters of their inclinations, what they would naturally do. So if you're one of those people who wants my water bottle, you will naturally just try to run up here and take it from me and maybe beat me to a bloody pulp to get it. An educated person would say, maybe I shouldn't do that. Or an educated person would say, I need to send this text message right now, but I'm also driving. So maybe it's not worth the risk of talking on the phone because I might crash my car and die. And kill others like my wonderful, nice guy professor who just happens to be driving the car next to me. So Locke says that education is really teaching people to have control over their kind of, animal instincts, or whatever you want to call them. And he says we want to teach people to control that from an early age. The system of education that would teach people self-control was pretty rigid back then. Used a lot of what we'd call today corporal punishment, physical punishment. If a kid gets out of line, you smack him. And that teaches a kid to not get out of line. Eventually, Locke said that's not a bad thing, especially with really young kids like infants. If they start running around getting out of control, smack them. Because they're so young, they're not going to remember it when they grow up. And they will have learned self-control, in his mind, if you smack them enough. But he says you only want to do that up to a certain age, because once they develop memory, you can teach them to really hate going to school if you hit them too much, right? If they give a bad answer on a test, or if they raise their hand to give an answer and they're wrong and you smack them for being wrong, that's only going to teach them what? To hate going to school. So they will hate being educated, and they will resist it. So he says that physical punishment, as you get older children, is not a very good thing, because that only kind of breaks their spirit, it breaks their creativity, and it makes them hate having to go to school. And if they have a choice, they will refuse. And then where will you be with a society of people who just don't want to learn? You're not going to have much progress there. So he says that that's a bad idea. He says the other side, rewarding children, especially with candy or some kind of toy or treat or something like that when they get a good answer, is also a bad idea. Why is that? Because that teaches them to get a right answer for what reason? To get the treat. Not because they want to get the right answer, but they want to get the reward. So Locke says that teaches children that we don't really value the idea so much, we value more the physical object. And he says that also hurts their desire for education long term. So he says he wants to balance these. He wants to find a way to convince children that it's bad to give a wrong answer, but without hitting them too much and destroying them intellectually and making them hate school. But to more kind of, when they give a bad answer, you say, well, no, that's not good enough. And give them that kind of emotional thing where they feel shameful, they feel bad about having answered incorrectly, and that would motivate them to seek the right answer more, without making them hate education too much. So it's a psychological thing. And then also on the other side, you don't give them treats or anything for having a good answer. You say how proud you are of them, how good they are. Right? So you build them up psychologically more to want to pursue the correct answer and to be kind of in control of themselves as they grow up, rather than just using kind of physical rewards and punishments. Does that make sense? Okay. Another person who wrote about education is named Rousseau. He lives quite a bit later. He goes into the mid-1700s. And he lives in France at first, and then he is forced to move around, or he chooses to move around. But he writes a few different things on education. One of his earlier essays, Discourse on Political Economy, is one of the first major public calls for education of the masses. And literally says that any good government that exists will choose to do this. And they will give government funding for schools to educate their population. If a government doesn't do that, that government is basically illegitimate. That government is not operating for the interests of its people. And he writes another much longer book in 1962 called Amel, which is about a boy named Amel. And his book is kind of it's a fiction. It's a kind of following around Amel and his kind of female friend as they grow up. And in doing that, he gives his outline of what education should look like in a lot of ways. So in Amel, he calls for what he says is negative education, because Rousseau argues in the book that you cannot use reason to teach children, because they're not rational, right? Children don't develop rational thought capabilities in Rousseau's mind until they start getting into their teenage years. So you can't teach them rationally when they're 8 years old. That's not going to work. They don't have that ability yet. So instead of using reason to teach them, he wants to have an open field of opportunity for children to be creative. So he calls it negative education, which basically means if you ask the question, where's the Mississippi River on the map? And the child points out a place on the map. If he gets it wrong, you tell the child, no, that's wrong. Where do you think it is now? And that's his system for education. That's why he calls it negative education, because he only points it out when it's wrong, because he doesn't want to break their creativity, he doesn't want to break their ability to find the answer themselves. Are there any flaws in that theory? What happens if I give a map quiz asking where the Mississippi River is, and I only tell you when you're wrong? What do you do next? You point out another place. Yeah, you keep guessing until you get it right, which could go on forever. So Rousseau is often one of the more extreme philosophers of the Enlightenment. He has ideas of freedom and equality that are far beyond, at least political equality, especially amongst men. He's very much sexist. And he doesn't really want women educated at all. So he's focused on boys being educated. But he is one of the more extremists of the Enlightenment, who says we want open opportunity, we want creativity, and creates a lot of kind of philosophical problems within his own ideas. So that's one of his shortcomings, and he's more of an idealist, he's more of a kind of purist. And he often leads human society because when he puts these ideas out there and he starts getting criticism, he's a person who doesn't really handle criticism very well. He thinks he's always under attack. So eventually he leaves the cities and he chooses to go off and live in nature. He goes off and lives in the woods in a cabin or something and writes there. So his books often talk about being out in the countryside in nature. Nature is the great teacher. And in his book, Amel, a lot of it takes place just out in nature. And Amel, the big student, learns from nature, learns from experiencing things out in rivers and forests and whatnot. And again, first edition. And he published this one at Amsterdam, which was a city in the Dutch Republic. And he eventually likes the city of Geneva more than any. So you can see up here in French, he calls himself a citizen of Geneva. That's where his heart was. That's his statement. He does not support the education of women. His opinion on women is to leave them, quote, barefoot and pregnant. That was their kind of operation in the world. That's all they were useful for in his mind. So even with these kind of extremist theorists on freedom, creativity, a lot of them are still very heavily sexist. Okay. Moving on into morality. Adam Smith is another intellectual giant of the Enlightenment. Publishes books. His most famous is called The Wealth of Nations, Economics, creating the theory of capitalism, basically. Increased efficiency that leads to capitalism. So he's mostly identified with that, but he has another giant book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is literally trying to come up with why do people behave morally or immorally in society? Where do they learn this stuff? Where do they learn what is right and wrong? And some theorists said that God puts those ideas into our brain at birth, or we naturally learn those things from one area or another. So his book is very long. He considers a lot of different moral conundrums throughout the book, and how those conundrums are created and what the best results and best solutions to them are. In general, though, he says that humans are not born with what he calls a moral sense. They do not create one themselves. Did you sit down when you were a child and think to yourself, what is right and wrong? I will create an absolute code of conduct for myself. No, most of us don't do that. Instead, Adam Smith argued that we learn morality through our interactions in public with other people. And we don't learn morality by someone coming to us and saying what right and wrong is. Some people may do that, but that's not where we get a moral sense. He says instead we get a sense of what is right and wrong according to the public reaction to a certain event. And his example is, say I am walking through the middle of a town. There's a bunch of people around. And maybe I sit down on a bench and I'm sitting there just kind of people watching, hanging out, watching things happen. And I notice one person in the middle of, say, an intersection of two different roads. One person takes out a knife, stabs another person to death right in front of everyone else. Just takes them out. Do I learn morality from that act? Adam Smith says no. He says we learn morality from what the rest of the public do in response to that act. Do they all sit around and say, that was good form. I really like the way you jabbed that in there with that specific angle. No. Most people, when they see something like that, are horrified. And they're afraid. And they start talking quickly about putting the stabber in jail to eliminate the threat. So Adam Smith says that we learn morality from everyone else taking a step back and saying, oh, this is a horrible thing that just happened. That's where we learn that it's horrible. And we learn it as young children in our first interactions in society. But that opens a very obvious problem that Adam Smith addresses later. Some people only react in certain ways because they expect other people to respond. Say, what if I was one of the people who believed that, that was a really good stabbing. I really support the way you did that. That was a really artistic way of killing somebody. Am I going to do that in public? Probably not. Why? Yeah, because I want other people to like me. So even if I don't believe it, I may gasp back and go, oh, that's a horrible thing. Just because I expect other people to do it and I want them to like me. And Adam Smith says that if that's you, you are not really a good person. You are a vain person. You are more worried about what other people think of you than what is right or wrong. And he calls that vanity. The desire for people's appreciation or approbation is the word he used. So these are the kind of people who say, if I have a whole bunch of money, I give it to charity, not because I want to see that charity do well and help others, but because I want other people to see me giving the money to charity, and so I'll be popular. Does that make sense? So he calls that vanity, rather than the person who gives money anonymously because they really want to help others. He says that that is real virtue, because that deserves public acceptance. And the people who want to do things quietly, don't want to be in the spotlight, but they want to really help, those are the really virtuous people. Those that do it publicly just because it's public. Those people are vain. They are worried about what others think, and that's their kind of driving focus in life, to impress others. Questions about that at all? Yeah.
How would you know the difference between someone knows something just for vanity and someone knows something for virtue?
That's one of the major problems. When he published the book, that was when he went to the debates, that's the one that they really hit him on. How do you know? And he later wrote kind of additions to this theory. So he got involved in the debate and changed his work over time to try to address it. But in my mind, he never really addresses it very well. Because in the end, you don't. Right? This is where con men get powerful. They can try to convince you and build confidence in you that they are a trustworthy person when they aren't. When you shouldn't trust them. That's where the con comes from. It's a confidence game. Okay, there's another theory of morality and what we should, how we come to the idea of what we should do. This is put out by a guy named Bentham, and he calls it the principles of morals and legislation. He defined this idea of what he calls the moral calculus. So he says that humans are led by two different things. Either the pursuit of pleasure for themselves, whatever they enjoy, and the avoidance of pain, things that they avoid because it's dangerous or hurtful. He says those are the things that really motivate people. So Bentham argued in his so-called moral calculus, if you have a major decision in your life, you can't really decide between one or the other, whether or not to do something. He says a good idea would be to get out a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and list all the good possible results, or all the good likely results on one side, and all the bad likely results on the other side. Cross out the ones that are basically the same thing in reverse. Right? And then you add them up. So eventually it looks more like moral arithmetic or moral addition than an actual kind of calculus, but calculus was a popular term back then because of Newton. Newton invented calculus. Did you guys know that? In the book where he proposed the theory of gravity. He invented calculus to prove it. Another guy also invented calculus at almost the exact same time, which is interesting, and they didn't have much contact with each other. So there's a lot of debate amongst historians today about who should we give credit to, but historically Newton is recognized. But that's his idea of how to come to moral conclusions. Just add it up. If you get more things on the side that will be good for you, that cause pleasure or pursue pleasure, then you do that thing. If you get more likely bad results, then you don't do that thing. Pretty simple, right? So there's a few different ideas on morality. Getting now into gender, one of my favorite books that I've ever read, and one of the most important books in the 1700s, that very much argued against Rousseau's theory of inherent female inequality and inability to learn. Mary Wollstonecraft lives toward the end of the Enlightenment and publishes her major book, and her most famous one is called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So in the 1790s, right toward the kind of end of the Enlightenment for a few different reasons. But her argument is that women are not really respected much in society. Because women back then operated on purely emotional means. They responded very emotionally to ideas or plans or thoughts or actions or events. And women were insulted for that. And this is where Rousseau comes up with the idea that, women act so emotionally so much in their lives that they cannot be educated. They're too emotional. They're not capable of rational thought or any kind of research or anything like that. It's just not the way they are born. Wollstonecraft took issue with that. And she argued that much more likely that's an excuse to keep women ignorant and barefoot and pregnant. And if you don't allow them the opportunity to learn to read and think critically and use reason, then of course they will never be able to escape the emotional kind of perspective on life. Right? If you don't even give them the opportunity to learn, then how can you argue that they shouldn't learn? You should at least take a population of women and educate them with men and see if they are capable. Run some kind of experiment. But a lot of the men didn't want to do that for a lot of different reasons. A lot of men are sexist, and a lot of men like to have control over women. So Wollstonecraft became educated at a fairly early age through parents of her friends, basically, and some neighbors who recognized a lot of intellectual talents in her as a child and taught her to read. And she eventually started trying to build schools, and specifically schools for girls. But she said that the basic lack of female education by default puts women in a place as they grow into adults where they're still basically like emotional children. They react too powerfully, too passionately, with too much fear in whatever kind of situation they're in. And the very fact that they are not education just puts them in that place by default. And she had a very strong criticism of women's role in society. The people like Rousseau basically said that women are only good for being wives and mothers, taking care of the house. And that women's biggest goal in life is to get married. And obviously to marry the wealthiest and most powerful guy she probably could. So, what kind of women are the ones who usually marry the real rich guys? If they're not highly educated. What do men consider as good qualities in women? Back then, at least, if not a lot of men today. Yeah, physical attraction. So the most attractive women tended to marry the richest guys, right? Or say be kept around by the richest guys. Put it vaguely, to put it humanely. So Wollstonecraft said, if you don't educate these girls, then they're going to form emotional bonds with men and will decide to get married just purely based on passion and emotion, without any kind of reasonable or rational thought. And Wollstonecraft said that's a major trap, because emotion doesn't last, right? For those of you who have been with one person or been married or something like that for several years, that emotion at the outset tends to fade over time. And Wollstonecraft says, what happens in 20 years where you made an emotional decision way long ago, and now you're stuck with this guy, and there's not much you can do about it, and he kind of treats you badly and all that, you have no way out. So Wollstonecraft argued for women that marriage should not be based, and love should not be based in just a very quick kind of passionate physical attraction, because that doesn't last. People get older. So where does she want love to be a result of? Yeah. Friendship. And intellectual friendship. She wanted two people who agreed on a lot of things, who both knew how to read, who could debate with each other, and were just attracted not just physically but also intellectually, where they could create basically an academic friendship, and that's what creates strong marriages. And she didn't want women to focus on beauty or wearing nice clothes or makeup and all that stuff, because she says that's just a distraction for women. And her big quote is, she says that putting on all the makeup and wearing all the small shoes and getting your hair done and all that actually harms the body, so it's unhealthy. And you basically turn these women into like dolls that men keep around because they look good, not because of any other reason. And she calls this delicacy, which basically insults women by saying that women are weak. And they will be kept around and kept basically as servants of men, as long as they continue thinking that that's all they should be doing in life, is dedicating themselves to looking good for men. And eventually Wollstonecraft argued in the book that women become, quote, slaves to their bodies that glory in their subjection. And that's how men like it, right? She says the best way for women to break out of that is to get rid of the makeup and all the nice dresses and all the hairdos and all that kind of stuff and learn something. So she refused to wear makeup and she wore plain clothes, and that's the kind of person she became. She advertised this. And she put this in the book and published it throughout Europe. And it's a very controversial thing because it's attacking gender norms, right? A lot of women didn't like Wollstonecraft. In fact, hated her. Why do you think a lot of women would hate these ideas? What kind of women hate these ideas? Yeah, the most attractive ones, because if you tell women to get rid of all that stuff and more pursue education, and that's what marriage should be built on, the most attractive ones are going to lose out on marrying the rich guys. Their power will be taken away. So the most attractive ones rejected this because they saw it as an attack on their pursuit of wealth and stability for themselves. So does all this make sense? It's a fascinating book. And it's really not very long. It's only about 80 or 90 pages. But there's major, giant statements on equality in here. And she said, if you're going to talk about political equality and say the American Revolution, where we shouldn't be run by a king up on high, she says, why not in your own homes? How does it make sense to rebel against a king but not against the monarch of the home? And she becomes known as one of the first very early feminist thinkers. So a lot of feminist philosophy develops out of this call for equality. And from the title, The Rights of Women. So, questions about that at all? Nope. Nothing at all? No one's interested? Yeah.
So did she ever get married or anything?
Yes, she did. She married another academic who was a writer and wrote giant books. His name was Godwin, William Godwin. He was fairly wealthy. But she didn't marry him because he was rich. She married him because they agreed on a lot of things. He supported her in all these statements. He believed in it completely. And they went to salons and they held meetings in their houses. She kept her own house. So she lived a few blocks down the road or so. So she was independent in a lot of ways. And she had her own income based off of writing. She dies very young because she decides to have children with him. And her first child, a lot of women died in childbirth back then through infection. Because they don't have very good hospitals back then. They don't have very good monitoring systems like we have today. Tons of women died in childbirth or in the days after. And she was one of them. So her voice is silenced very quickly after this book comes out. And she dies at a fairly early age. But yes, she did get married, but she also pursued her philosophy. I mean, she didn't sell out all of her ideas just because she wanted to get married to a rich guy. Yeah.
And did you try burning her house down while she was trying to write these books?
Well, her first book is called The Vindication of the Rights of Man, which is a kind of getting involved in the French Revolution and how you should have equality politically. So she put that one out there, and that's where she got a big following by supporting and defending the French Revolution. She very quickly after that just put this one out. So it was already out there, so she couldn't really be killed or her ideas on this couldn't be killed just by taking her out. Because she puts it out there and it's out. If you kill her now, the idea is still out. Just like that movie V for Vendetta says, ideas are bulletproof. They will go on no matter how many people you kill. Right? As, the Syrian government's finding out, and hopefully other places that are suffering under dictatorships find out.
Did you enjoy the movie?
Oh, yeah, I loved it. I think it's kind of extreme in a lot of ways. I mean, the guy gets shot like 50 times and he literally doesn't die for a while because he has an idea. I don't know if that happened, but...
Besides the fact of being all burned as well, right?
Yeah, it seems kind of unlikely to me, but... Tough to try until you run some experiments, but we're seeing experiments happen in places like Syria and whatnot now. Other questions? Nope. Yep.
Does her child survive?
Yes, the child survives. They named the child Mary after her, so you get another Mary Wollstonecraft.
Did it place the same values on the child too?
Yes. She became educated. She became a writer herself. She eventually married a guy named Shelley. She became Mary Shelley, and she's the one who wrote the book Frankenstein.
Wow, really?
Yep. And if you read Frankenstein, there's a lot of philosophy in there. Not like most of the movies where the monster just kind of walks around going, If you read that book, the monster was educated. The monster read philosophy. The monster it was basically a taught person who knew how to communicate and felt things very deeply. So the idea is that what happens when science gets out of control, you still get those kinds of criticisms. But the monster himself becomes a philosopher and he writes letters. A lot of the book is from the monster's perspective because he writes all this stuff down.
What inspired her and motivated her to write that book?
What, Frankenstein? A lot of the philosophical debates, and there's a lot of kind of really creepy scientific pursuits in the early 1800s. And apparently she was living in a castle, and she got the idea because there's a lightning storm, and they're telling like ghost stories that night. And that's the story she told in the beginning, and decided to later write it into a book.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Probably the closest movie ever made on it is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with De Niro from about 20 years ago. De Niro and Kenneth Branagh. That's very close to the book. Almost all the other Frankenstein movies have almost nothing to do with the book. It's really sad. That's why I like Young Frankenstein, because they really just rip on all those stupid movies. Yeah, it's Mel Brooks. I like Mel Brooks. That's me. Okay, moving on. Last one I want to do is on art, the Enlightenment's perception on art. And you can see with a lot of these kinds of definitions, this guy Burke wrote a long pamphlet on art's importance in the world and for human society. And he takes a lot of these kind of mathematical equations and puts them into art criticism. So he agrees with Bentham that people tend to pursue what is pleasurable to them, what he calls the sublime, and that was a popular term in the 1700s among the artistic communities. Or, pain and terror is the sublime, and pleasure is beauty. And pain, the sublime is, I got it backwards, it's like kind of sadness, melancholy, or fear, and all the kind of bad stuff. And the pursuit of pleasure is the pursuit of beauty and great things that inspire people to do good things. And Burke's one of his basic arguments in this pamphlet is that people are motivated by which, do you think? The pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain? Which motivates people more? He says the avoidance of pain. And his, to put it in a very simple analogy, his experiment is to say you're standing at the end of a long hallway. And at the end of that hallway, to test the beauty side, imagine the most beautiful person you've ever seen that you're very attractive to, completely naked. How fast do you run to that person? Pretty fast, probably. But, he says, if you're at the end of a long hallway, and instead of the beautiful naked person, you see Jack Nicholson walking at you with an axe, like from The Shining. Does that motivate you to move faster? Oh, yeah. He says people are much more motivated by avoiding pain and terror than they are by pursuing pleasure. He said that art has a goal in human society, and that is to lift people up to think about nature and human society kind of on the level of God. That when you look at nature and you understand the beauty and the complexity of it, that is where you start to appreciate God's work. And Burke is a religious conservative, so he very much believes in the existence of God and the creation and all that. And he says that for a lot of people who have to work all the time, they can't really go out into nature and go on picnics and whatnot, the closest they ever get is seeing a nice painting or hearing a nice song, and that inspires them with great feelings about nature and to appreciate God's work. And he has a whole series of descriptions on why humans fear the dark, why they fear loud noises, because it's mysterious. When you're in a dark room, you don't know what's out there, so you get scared. When you hear big, loud noises, that implies that something out there is much larger than you, which can threaten to harm you, and so you become afraid. It makes people feel vulnerable. And vulnerability is often attached to terror. And he says that beauty operates in a different way. It doesn't really kind of logically inspire terror in us or pleasure in us. He says that beauty is much more like when you touch something warm or you hold your hand up to a fire and you feel warmth, it inspires that feeling of warmth in you. It's not a logical or a reasonable thing. It's just a kind of human reaction. A muscle reaction. He says that beauty in art does the same thing. It doesn't rely on a person's choice or any kind of critical thought. It's just a feeling they get. And of course, the more beautiful the art, the greater the feeling, the greater the appreciation for nature and God's work. So the best art kind of connects people to the infinite. The idea that maybe we're all one and that all this stuff is all happening for a reason, that there's some kind of giant plan out there and that we're just one small piece of it. So he says the greatest art gives people that feeling of not really just being alone and chaotic, but they're a part of something that's much larger than themselves. So that's Burke on art. Questions about him at all? Nope. Okay, but you see how he's applying a lot of these kind of scientific revolution type theories to human societies and human interactions.